We tend to assume that people who care deeply about gold are afraid of losing money, that they're bracing for instability, downturns, or some distant moment when things fall apart. It feels like a straightforward explanation, almost comforting in its simplicity. Fear equals protection. Risk equals retreat. But when you slow down and listen to how these people actually talk, a different concern begins to emerge. Not panic, not even loss. What shows up instead is a quiet, persistent discomfort with the idea of being cheated. Most of us don't notice how much emotional weight we place on fairness until it feels threatened. Money, after all, isn't just a way to measure value. It's a way we keep score. It tells us whether effort mattered, whether patience was rewarded, whether the rules we followed were the same rules everyone else was playing by. When that sense of fairness feels intact, losses can be tolerated. They can be explained away as timing, circumstance, or chance. But when fairness feels compromised, loss becomes something else entirely. It starts to feel personal. It feels natural to believe that fear announces itself loudly, that it shows up as anxiety, urgency, or dramatic decisions. But the fear of being cheated doesn't behave that way. It's quieter, more analytical. It often presents itself as skepticism, caution, or a preference for things that seem harder to manipulate. This kind of fear doesn't rush toward safety. It steps back and watches, waiting for patterns to reveal themselves. Most of us don't notice when trust erodes because it rarely collapses all at once. It fades in small increments. A promise that changes meaning after the fact. A rule that seems flexible only in one direction. An outcome that technically follows procedure but still feels wrong. None of these moments are dramatic enough to demand confrontation. But together, they create a subtle shift in perception. The system may still function, but it no longer feels impartial. When that happens, people don't immediately change their behavior. They change their posture. They become more observant, less expressive, more interested in how things have worked historically than how they're described in the present. This isn't nostalgia in the romantic sense. It's an attempt to anchor trust somewhere outside the current moment, somewhere that feels less vulnerable to reinterpretation. We tend to assume that belief systems around money are built from information, charts, data, explanations. But often they're built from experiences that didn't quite make sense at the time. Moments that left a residue of doubt. The mind doesn't forget those moments. It files them away, even if we can't articulate why they mattered. Over time, those fragments form a story about how the world works, or more specifically, how it doesn't. In everyday life, this might look like someone who doesn't react strongly to headlines or sudden changes. They appear calm, almost detached. But underneath that calm is a vigilance shaped by past surprises. They're not afraid of volatility. They're afraid of discovering, too late, that stability was an illusion maintained for someone else's benefit. The idea of cheating carries a unique psychological weight. It implies intent. It suggests that someone knew the rules and chose to bend them quietly, confident that most people wouldn't notice until it no longer mattered. That implication strikes at something deeper than financial loss. It threatens the belief that participation itself is meaningful, that playing honestly counts for something. It feels natural to believe that money decisions are about maximizing outcomes, but for many people, they're about minimizing regret. And not just any regret, a very specific kind. The regret of having trusted a system that didn't deserve it. The embarrassment of realizing that caution would have been wiser than optimism. That believing in fairness made you predictable. Most of us don't like to think of ourselves as naive. So when doubt creeps in, it doesn't announce itself as fear. It presents itself as discernment, as maturity, as having learned something the hard way. This reframing is important because it protects self-image. It allows skepticism to feel like growth rather than withdrawal. In this context, gold becomes less an asset and more a symbol. Not because it promises certainty, but because it doesn't explain itself. It doesn't require belief in narratives, projections, or assurances. It simply exists. For someone sensitive to manipulation, that simplicity can feel grounding. It's not that gold is trusted more, it's that it asks for less trust in the first place. We tend to assume that people seek control when they feel uncertain. But often, they're seeking clarity, a way to separate what feels solid from what feels performative. The fear of cheating isn't about expecting the worst, it's about refusing to be surprised by it again. This is why conversations around gold can feel emotionally charged even when the tone stays measured. Because beneath the surface, the subject isn't metal or value. It's dignity. It's the desire to believe that restraint, patience, and sincerity won't quietly become liabilities. And that belief, once shaken, doesn't return easily. Most of us don't notice how much we rely on money to validate our understanding of the world. We expect it to reflect effort accurately, to reward consistency, to behave in ways that feel fair even when outcomes aren't ideal. When it fails to do that, the discomfort lingers, not as fear, but as suspicion. And that suspicion doesn't ask dramatic questions. It asks small ones. Who benefits when rules change? Who absorbs the cost when they do? Who gets explanations and who gets silence? These questions don't lead to panic. They lead to distance. A quiet step back from systems that feel less predictable than they appear. This is where the story truly begins. Not with loss, but with the moment someone realizes that fairness might be conditional, that honesty might not be enough, and that being careful isn't about avoiding pain, but about avoiding a specific kind of realization. The realization that the game was never quite what it claimed to be. Once that realization takes hold, behavior begins to shift in ways that are easy to misinterpret. From the outside, it can look like caution or rigidity, maybe even pessimism. But internally, it often feels like calibration, a quiet adjustment based on past signals that didn't align with the story people were told. Most of us don't notice when this happens because it doesn't arrive as a single decision. It unfolds gradually, shaped by memory rather than prediction. We tend to assume that people respond to uncertainty by seeking certainty. But more often, they respond by redefining what feels trustworthy. Trust stops being about optimism and starts being about consistency, not whether something will always work out, but whether it behaves the same way under pressure. This is a subtle psychological shift. It moves attention away from outcomes and toward process, away from promises and toward behavior. In everyday situations, this can show up as someone who listens carefully but commits slowly. Someone who asks fewer questions about potential upside and more about who sets the rules. They may not articulate this openly. In fact, they often avoid dramatic language altogether. But internally, there's a running comparison between what is said and what tends to happen. When those two drift apart too often, skepticism becomes less of a reaction and more of a default setting. Most of us don't notice how quickly the mind begins to protect itself once it detects inconsistency. We start relying on mental shortcuts that feel safer. Familiar patterns feel more reliable than complex explanations. Simplicity feels honest. And things that don't require interpretation begin to feel less risky, even if they aren't objectively more stable. This isn't about logic failing. It's about the brain conserving emotional energy. People often assume those who gravitate toward gold are clinging to the past, driven by nostalgia. In reality, the pull comes from fatigue, tiredness from constantly updating assumptions and reinterpreting shifting rules. At some point, the mind prefers something that doesn't demand reinterpretation or change meaning depending on who explains it. Underlying this is a deeper emotional pattern: avoidance of humiliation. Loss can be framed as bad luck, but being cheated implies misjudgment. It signals that one trusted someone they shouldn't have. This threat extends beyond financial loss. It challenges self-respect, and the mind works to prevent that feeling long before it reaches consciousness. Small, unresolved disappointments often shape behavior more than big mistakes. They linger, creating background noise in decision-making. Over time, people favor things harder to manipulate, not because they're perfect, but because they reduce the risk of feeling foolish. Social comparison reinforces this. We notice who benefits when systems shift, who adapts easily, and who is perpetually surprised. These observations often lead to withdrawal, as full engagement carries hidden costs and demands tolerance for ambiguity. In this environment, certainty is less appealing than predictability. Predictability isn't about outcomes. It's about knowing how systems behave under pressure. For many, gold symbolizes that predictability. It doesn't pretend to be something it isn't, nor does it demand belief in narratives of innovation or progress. Its emotional neutrality provides stability. The fear of being cheated doesn't lead to avoidance. It fosters scrutiny. Vigilance becomes a quiet, analytical stance, narrowing what someone is willing to trust. Over time, skepticism solidifies into a worldview. It's safer to assume complexity hides advantage than to assume fairness prevails. This offers emotional relief, reducing surprise, tempering expectations, and replacing hope with preparedness. Yet preparedness can crowd out openness. Once being wrong feels too costly, trust becomes selective, shaped by past experiences where clarity arrived too late, or outcomes were only explained afterward. Gold, in this sense, isn't certainty. It's an emotional boundary. It separates what feels interpretable from what feels opaque. People want systems to behave in ways that align with cause and effect. When they don't, discomfort emerges, sometimes settling into belief, sometimes into distance, and sometimes into symbols like gold, which absorb tension without demanding resolution. As these patterns mature, they shape social interactions. Subtle cues, who sounds rehearsed, who speaks in principles, become signals of credibility. Financial beliefs are deeply social, evolving through comparison and alignment. Shared suspicions provide relief, transforming doubt from paranoia into perception. Independence often looks like finding a group that agrees on what not to trust. Skepticism becomes a marker of self-respect and identity, reinforced socially through shared recognition. Gold functions as a symbol of restraint and virtue, reflecting discipline, patience, and refusal to be rushed into belief. It helps reconcile the tension between personal boundaries and social belonging. Yet skepticism carries emotional costs. It follows into conversations where optimism thrives, producing tension between belonging and self-protection. Distance feels safe, preserving options and reducing vulnerability, but it can also separate, making shared optimism feel foreign. People seek consistency and stability. These reinforce self-image and integrity. However, tying identity to skepticism makes changing one's mind risky, socially and emotionally. Rigidity protects, but can limit experience. Beliefs begin to defend the self, rather than explain the world. Gold, skepticism, and restraint become symbols of identity. I know who I am, and I know what I won't accept. This internal conflict isn't about money. It's about belonging without surrender, engaging without becoming vulnerable, and preserving self-respect when trust feels conditional. Fear transforms into alignment, a quiet realism shaped by experience. Yet, a lingering question remains. Has self-protection come at the cost of something less tangible, but equally real? Ultimately, this story isn't about gold. It's about how people navigate uncertainty, conditional fairness, and the emotional strategies they adopt to avoid the pain of misplaced trust. Gold serves as a lens to understand these patterns. It's a symbol that absorbs concerns about fairness, continuity, and trust without requiring resolution. What people cling to isn't about fearing the future. It's about making sense of the past and preserving dignity along the way.